The day I uncovered my late husband's forgotten bank statement, everything I believed the man who spent 26 years convincing me we had to count every dollar had secretly been sitting on a fortune worth $33 million. Even now, I can still hear the bank manager's calm voice repeating the three words that changed my life forever: he left instructions. I sat frozen on the floor of Richard's home office, the paper trembling in my hands. My eyes kept returning to the impossible number printed at the bottom of the statement. $33 million. It had to be a mistake. Richard had never earned that kind of money. He worked for a regional trucking company, always telling me his paycheck barely covered our expenses. We spent years repairing old appliances instead of replacing them. We skipped vacations because we believed we couldn't afford them. We lived carefully, almost fearfully, every single month. Yet this statement carried his name. My name is Carol Whitmore. I'm 53 years old, and I live in Columbus, Ohio. 14 months before I found that envelope, I buried my husband after he suffered a sudden heart attack. Losing him had already turned my world upside down. But discovering that bank statement made me question whether I had ever truly known the man I shared my life with. Richard wasn't cruel. That's what made everything so confusing. Every Saturday morning he quietly placed a cup of coffee beside me before I even opened my eyes. He remembered birthdays better than I did. He fixed broken shelves without being asked and never forgot to kiss my forehead before leaving for work. Looking back now, those memories still feel real. But so do the lies. When our washing machine broke a few years before he died, we spent 3 evenings debating whether we could afford another one. Richard insisted repairing it was the only sensible choice. I agreed because I trusted him completely. Now all I could think was, if he had millions hidden away, why did he let me worry about every bill? Why did he watch me struggle? And perhaps the question that hurt the most, why didn't he trust me enough to tell me the truth? My thoughts drifted toward his younger sister, Patricia. She and Richard had always shared a bond I never completely understood. Every Sunday they disappeared into long phone conversations. Sometimes they laughed about stories that ended the moment I entered the room. I convinced myself it was simply the closeness of siblings. Now those memories felt different. Too different. After Richard's funeral, Patricia arrived at my house almost immediately, moving through my kitchen as though she belonged there. At the time I assumed grief explained everything. But sitting there with that bank statement in my hands, I couldn't stop wondering. Had she known? For more than a year after Richard's death, I handled everything a widow is expected to handle. I closed accounts, organized paperwork, and slowly packed away pieces of a life we had built together. Nothing unusual appeared until that October afternoon when I reached behind a dusty shoebox on the highest shelf of his closet. Hidden against the back wall was a plain manila envelope. Inside was only one document. One bank statement. One unbelievable secret. After nearly an hour of staring at it, I finally forced myself to act. I carried the paper into the kitchen, found the customer service number printed across the top, and dialed with shaking fingers. A polite man answered. I explained who I was. I told him Richard had been my husband. I asked whether the account was real. Silence filled the line for several seconds. Then, in a measured voice that revealed nothing, he quietly said, he left instructions. My heart pounded. Instructions? What instructions? And why would my husband leave them for a secret fortune I was never supposed to know existed? At that moment, I realized I wasn't just searching for money anymore. I was searching for the truth hidden inside my own marriage. I barely remember ending the call with the bank manager. My mind had become a storm of unanswered questions. The only thing I knew for certain was that Richard had hidden something enormous from me, and whatever those instructions were, they had been important enough for the bank to mention before anything else. That night, sleep never came. I lay in the same bed where Richard and I had shared 26 years of conversations, arguments, laughter, and quiet mornings. Every memory replayed itself through a completely different lens. The broken washing machine. The family vacations we never took. The second-hand cars we proudly called practical. Then another memory surfaced, one that hit harder than all the others. In 2017, my mother needed an emergency hip replacement. Insurance covered only part of the operation, leaving us responsible for thousands of dollars we simply didn't have. I remembered standing alone outside the hospital, crying into my phone while Richard tried to comfort me. "We'll figure it out," he had promised. And we did. We emptied nearly all of our savings to help my mother. At the time, I thought my husband had sacrificed everything he could. Now I knew he had been protecting a fortune while watching me believe we were nearly broke. That realization hurt far more than the money itself. Around 4 in the morning, I gave up trying to sleep. I made coffee, grabbed a legal pad, and began writing down every moment from our marriage that suddenly felt suspicious. Patricia's weekly phone calls. The private conversations that always stopped when I entered the room. The Christmas when Patricia unexpectedly gave us $1,000 check. I had thanked her with tears in my eyes, believing she was helping us through difficult times. Richard had accepted it without surprise, almost as if the gift meant something completely different to him than it did to me. Doug, Patricia's husband, also came to mind. Whenever money became part of a conversation, Doug somehow managed to change the subject. At family dinners, he always smiled politely, redirected everyone towards sports or travel, and avoided financial discussions altogether. Back then it seemed harmless. Now it felt deliberate. I circled one question at the top of my notebook. Did Patricia know the truth? By sunrise, 2 pages were filled with notes, timelines, and questions that had no answers. One thing had become clear. If $33 million truly existed, I couldn't afford a single careless mistake. That morning I made 3 decisions. The first was simple. I wouldn't tell anyone. Not my younger sister Karen. Not my neighbor Donna. Not even Patricia. Especially not Patricia. If someone had spent years hiding this secret, I needed to assume they were still protecting it. The second decision was to hire an attorney who specialized in estate disputes. This wasn't an ordinary inheritance issue anymore. It involved hidden assets, private banking, and secrets that stretched back decades. The third decision frightened me the most. I was going to Chicago. If answers existed, they were waiting inside that private bank. But I refused to walk in unprepared. After breakfast, I searched online for attorneys experienced in probate litigation and concealed estates. One name appeared repeatedly in professional recommendations. Margaret Osei. Everything I read about her described the same qualities. Calm. Methodical. Impossible to intimidate. 2 days later, I sat across from her in a quiet office in downtown Columbus. The room reflected her personality, organized, modest, and free of unnecessary decoration. Without saying much, she listened while I laid the bank statement on her desk. Then I handed her my notebook. She read every page. She asked only a handful of questions. When I finished explaining everything, she removed her reading glasses and looked directly at me. "Mrs. Whitmore," she said quietly, "you've done exactly the right thing by coming here first." For the first time since finding the envelope, I felt someone was standing beside me instead of watching from a distance. Margaret explained that, as Richard's surviving spouse, I still had legal rights, even if he had tried to leave assets to someone else. But everything depended on how the money had been structured. If that account belongs to a trust, she explained, or names beneficiaries outside the estate, the situation becomes much more complicated. I swallowed hard. So what do? We make them acknowledge your rights before anyone else has time to react. That same afternoon, Margaret prepared formal legal requests to the bank and gathered every document she needed, our marriage certificate, Richard's death certificate, and paperwork proving my status as his widow. Before I left her office, she gave me one final piece of advice. "Until we know exactly what's hidden inside that account," she said, "trust no one who suddenly becomes interested in how you're doing." At the time, I thought she was simply being cautious. Less than an hour after I arrived home, my phone rang. The screen displayed a familiar name. Patricia. Patricia's name glowed on my phone screen while I stood in the middle of my kitchen, unable to move. She rarely called outside of our usual Wednesday conversations. Seeing her name that afternoon, just hours after Margaret had sent legal notices to the bank, made my stomach tighten. I let the call ring until it went to voicemail. A minute later, my phone buzzed with a message. "Carol, it's me. Just wanted to check on you. Call me when you can." The words sounded warm enough, but something about them felt rehearsed. I didn't call back. The following morning, Margaret phoned with an update. "The bank received our request," she said. "That's important. What happens now? They'll review the documents and prepare their response. But remember something, Carol. Once legal notices are filed, anyone connected to that trust may learn that you've discovered it." Those words stayed with me all day. By Tuesday, I was driving to Chicago. I told my neighbor Donna that I was visiting an old college friend for a couple of days. It wasn't exactly a lie, I simply couldn't risk anyone asking questions I wasn't ready to answer. The drive felt longer than it actually was. Every mile brought another memory of Richard. His laugh. His quiet smile. The way he hummed while making breakfast. I kept asking myself the same impossible question. Was the man I loved real? Or had I only known the version he wanted me to see? By late afternoon I checked into a small hotel a few blocks from Michigan Avenue. I hardly unpacked. My folder of legal documents stayed beside me the entire evening. The next morning, dressed in my charcoal blazer, I walked toward First Meridian Private Bank. The building looked exactly how enormous wealth imagines itself: glass walls, polished stone floors, silent elevators, and people who spoke softly. The receptionist smiled politely after checking my identification. "Mr. Bloom will be with you shortly." A few minutes later, Gerald Bloom entered the conference room. He looked almost exactly as I'd imagined from his voice, silver-haired, calm, and impossible to read. He shook my hand firmly. "Mrs. Whitmore, thank you for coming." He placed a thick folder on the table but didn't open it immediately. "I understand this has been an unexpected discovery." "Unexpected doesn't begin to describe it," I replied. For the first time, I noticed a flicker of sympathy in his expression. After confirming my identity and reviewing the legal paperwork Margaret had prepared, he slowly opened the folder. "Your husband established this account through a revocable family trust over 20 years ago," he explained. My pulse quickened. He continued carefully. "The trust currently lists 2 beneficiaries."
I held my breath. Patricia Whitmore Hayes. And Douglas Hayes. For a moment, I couldn't hear anything else. Patricia. Doug. Not me. After 26 years of marriage, my name wasn't anywhere on the trust. A strange calm settled over me instead of anger. Some part of me had already expected this. Then Gerald reached into the folder again. "However," he said quietly, "there is another document you need to see." He slid a single handwritten page across the table. I recognized Richard's handwriting instantly. Every grocery list. Every birthday card. Every anniversary note. There was no mistaking it. The page was dated March 2018. Only weeks after my mother's surgery. My eyes scanned the short paragraph. "If my wife, Carol, ever learns of this trust, she is to receive complete disclosure regarding its contents. She is also to be provided independent legal counsel at the trust's expense.
I believe she will know what to do." I read it again. Then a third time. Richard had hidden $33 million from me. Yet years before his death, he had left instructions making sure I would eventually learn the truth. Why? Was he planning to tell me someday? Had guilt finally caught up with him? Or had he known he might never get the chance? Did my husband explain why he added this? I asked. Gerald slowly shook his head. He never discussed his personal reasons. But he came here himself? Yes. Was he afraid? Gerald paused before answering. He appeared to be carrying something very heavy. Those words stayed with me long after our meeting ended. As I walked back onto the busy streets of Chicago, I wasn't thinking about the money anymore. I was thinking about the contradiction. Richard had betrayed me. Yet somehow, he had also left me the key to uncovering his betrayal. Back in Columbus, Margaret examined the handwritten addendum with intense focus. "This changes everything," she finally said. "How?" "It proves Richard wanted you involved eventually. More importantly, it gives us strong legal grounds to challenge the trust." Before I could respond, my phone vibrated on the desk. Patricia. Again. This time, she didn't leave a voicemail. Instead, less than 2 hours later, someone knocked on my front door. When I looked through the window, my heart skipped a beat. Patricia wasn't alone. Doug was standing beside her. And judging by the expressions on their faces, they already knew I had uncovered Richard's secret. The knock came again. Slow. Deliberate. I stood in the hallway for several seconds before opening the door just enough to face them. Patricia wore the same calm expression she had carried at Richard's funeral. Doug stood beside her with his hands tucked into his coat pockets, forcing a smile that never reached his eyes. "Carol," Patricia said softly. "Can we talk?" I stepped outside and quietly closed the door behind me. "I think it's better if we stay out here." For a brief moment, none of us spoke. Doug finally broke the silence. "We heard you've been asking questions about Richard's finances." His words confirmed exactly what Margaret had warned me about. Someone had informed them. I kept my voice steady. "I'm simply trying to understand something my husband never explained." Patricia sighed, lowering her eyes as though carrying an unbearable burden. "Richard made certain decisions for reasons you don't understand." "Then help me understand." She exchanged a quick glance with Doug before answering. "The money wasn't meant to hurt you." "Then why hide it from me for over 20 years? Neither of them answered. Doug stepped forward instead. "Dragging this into court won't help anyone. It will destroy Richard's reputation." I folded my arms. If the truth destroys his reputation, maybe the truth deserves to be heard. His jaw tightened. "You don't know where that money came from." Those words caught my attention immediately. "What exactly are you implying?" Doug hesitated. "I'm saying some things are better left buried. For the first time since Richard died, I wasn't afraid." "If you're suggesting my husband did something illegal," I said calmly, "then a courtroom is exactly where those questions should be answered." Doug looked away. Patricia quickly stepped between us. "Carol. Please." Her voice cracked just enough to sound genuine. "We're family." I looked directly into her eyes. Family doesn't spend decades hiding $33 million from each other. Silence settled over the porch. Finally, Patricia reached into her handbag and removed a large envelope. "This doesn't have to become a public fight." I didn't touch it. "What is it?" "A settlement proposal." She held the envelope toward me. "You deserve something." "Something." The word echoed in my mind. I accepted the envelope without opening it. Doug looked relieved. "You should read it carefully before making any emotional decisions." "I'll let my attorney read it." The smile disappeared from his face. "There doesn't need to be attorneys. There already are." Without another word, I stepped back inside and closed the door. Only after their car disappeared down the street did I open the envelope. Inside was a formal offer. $750,000. At another point in my life, that amount would have seemed unimaginable. But now I knew the truth. They were offering me less than 3% of what Richard had hidden. It wasn't generosity. It was a test. They wanted to know whether I would quietly disappear. I photographed every page and immediately emailed Margaret. Less than 20 minutes later, my phone rang. She didn't waste time. "Don't sign anything." "I wasn't planning to." "Good," she replied. "Because this tells us something very important." "What?" "They're nervous." That single sentence changed everything. People who believe they'll win don't rush to settle. People who know they're vulnerable do. The next morning Margaret formally rejected the offer. No negotiations. No counter-proposal. Just one clear message. We would see them in court. Days passed without another phone call. No messages. No surprise visits. The silence felt strange. Almost too quiet. Then, one evening, I drove to my sister Karen's house in Pittsburgh and told her everything from the beginning. She listened without interrupting. When I finally finished, she reached across the kitchen table and squeezed my hand. "I don't care how much money is involved," she said quietly. What Richard did wasn't right. Hearing someone else say those words lifted a weight I hadn't realized I was carrying. For the first time since finding that envelope, I didn't feel alone anymore. A week later, Margaret called again. "The court has scheduled the first discovery hearing." I took a deep breath. "So?" She paused. "It's time to find out exactly where those $33 million really came from." At that moment, I realized the biggest secret of all still hadn't been revealed. The morning of the hearing arrived cold and gray, but for the first time in months, I felt something stronger than fear. I felt ready. Dressed in the navy suit I had worn to Richard's memorial service, I walked into the Cook County Courthouse beside Margaret. She carried two thick binders filled with financial records, legal filings, and evidence gathered over weeks of investigation. Across the courtroom sat Patricia and Doug with their attorneys. Neither of them looked in my direction. Margaret leaned toward me before the hearing began. "Whatever happens today," she whispered, "stay calm. The facts will speak louder than emotions." When the judge entered, the room fell silent. Margaret presented our case piece by piece, carefully explaining how Richard had created the trust years into our marriage and quietly transferred money into it without my knowledge. Then came the evidence that changed everything. Bank records showed the trust hadn't been built with mysterious family wealth. It had been funded using money from our joint marital income. Year after year, Richard had quietly diverted earnings into a separate company before moving those funds into the hidden trust. For over 2 decades, he had allowed me to believe we were barely making ends meet while the account grew into a fortune. The courtroom became noticeably quieter. Patricia's attorney argued that Richard had every legal right to manage his finances. Margaret calmly stood again. "Managing marital finances is one thing," she said. "Concealing marital assets from your spouse for over 20 years is another." Then she introduced Richard's handwritten addendum. The same note I had first seen in Chicago. "If my wife Carol discovers this trust, she is to receive full disclosure. I believe she will know what to do." The judge read the note carefully before placing it back on the bench. For the first time all morning, Patricia lowered her head. Doug stared silently at the table. Hours later, the hearing ended. The judge announced she would review the evidence and issue her decision soon. The waiting was harder than the hearing itself. Nearly 2 weeks passed before Margaret called. I answered before the first ring had finished. "We won." Those 2 words left me speechless. The court ruled that the trust had been created using marital assets that had been intentionally hidden throughout our marriage. Because of that, I was legally entitled to a substantial share of the estate. After several more weeks of negotiations, appeals, and settlement discussions, the final agreement was signed. Millions of dollars were transferred into an account under my name. The legal battle was finally over. People often ask me whether the money changed my life. The answer is yes. But not in the way most people imagine. The first thing I bought wasn't a luxury car or a mansion. It was a brand new washing machine. Not because I desperately needed one. Because for the first time in decades, I could choose what I wanted without wondering whether we could afford it. I established a charitable fund that helps families pay for surgeries they can't afford. I traveled with my sister Karen to places we had only dreamed about visiting. I continued teaching English because I loved watching people discover confidence through words. Some things, however, money could never repair. Richard remained the greatest contradiction of my life. He was the husband who brought me coffee every Saturday morning. The man who made me laugh. The man who comforted me when I cried. He was also the man who hid the truth from me for more than 20 years. I eventually stopped trying to decide which version of him was real. Both were. One afternoon, I returned to the oak tree Richard had planted during our first year in our home. I sat beneath its shade for a long time, thinking about everything that had happened. The betrayal. The courtroom. The hidden fortune. The painful truth. Then I realized something unexpected. Finding that forgotten bank statement hadn't simply uncovered $33 million. It had uncovered my own strength. Sometimes the greatest inheritance isn't money. It's finally seeing the truth. And having the courage to face it. The end.